I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with all of you and to that you've all chosen to be part of this session. So thank you for that. I really do look forward to diving into this information and this content with you all today. Real quick, since I know you're all introducing yourselves, as she said, I'm from just outside of Philadelphia. The organization that I work for is Lakeside. We're a network of alternative schools, but the program that I run is called the Neurologic Initiative, where we work with schools and educators trying to really bring about the trauma-informed lens, a trauma-informed viewpoint to all of the work that we do. Because really, we started first practicing with our own students and our own children that we were trying to support, and realizing really how helpful and advantageous these different practices were in being able to support them. And so I actually started my career as an educator and really was able to try firsthand all of these different tools and strategies that we're going to be talking through today, and have seen how they work with my students. And that's what's really gotten me excited about sharing this information with you all. One of the things that we found frustrating in our early days of trying to figure out the best way to support students, especially as this whole idea of trauma-informed work began to evolve more and more, was that there was a lot of people out there telling you what all the problems were, but not a lot of people that were talking about what can you do about it. And so my commitment to you all today is that I'm 100% going to be answering a lot of those questions of what are some things that we can do about it? What are tools and strategies that we can put in place to support the students that we're working with? And obviously, given everything that's going on right now, I realize that there's probably not a lot of you that are doing traditional school right now. So these are tools that can be used in the future in traditional schools. They can be used at home for those of you that are supporting your own children. They can be used for those of you that are supporting students remotely, or for those of you that are supporting families as they're trying to support students remotely. And so you'll hopefully find, as we delve into a lot of these tools and strategies, that there's a lot of different ways that they can adapt and that they can work in, traditional educational settings, as well as all sorts of different home and other settings. One of the goals one of the requests that I always make up front is just, as we're talking about this, as we're thinking about all these different ideas, don't get fixated on what do schools look like right now? What have we done in the past? But instead, make sure that we're kind of opening our eyes to what can we be doing differently in the future? How can we change in the way that we're going to be meeting the needs of all students? Because what's become obvious is that traditional school settings are not working for all students. In fact, there's a lot of students that they're not supporting. And so what we really want to be thinking through is, how can we support all students in the future? How should schools look in the future to be able to support every single child that comes our way? And so one of the things that's foundational to all the work that we're going to do, that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, but I believe is important to make sense of why I choose the different interventions that I use, is the basic understanding of the brain. So all the work that we do, we always try and connect it and correlate it with how the brain operates. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the brain, and from there being able to really help us to not only make some assumptions about where students might be operating from, or where children might be operating from in the brain, but also being able to then pinpoint the best tools for where they're at in the brain at that point in time. I did a lot of studying through Bruce Perry and the Child Trauma Academy, so you'll see his name tagged at the bottom of a lot of my slides. And really this kind of basic look at the brain, though others have done it in very similar ways, they are the people who I kind of learned this from, in terms of breaking the brain up into these 4 basic regions. And what's important to understand about the brain is that it develops and operates from a bottom-up mentality. And so what I mean by that, especially in terms of development, as we're thinking about things through a trauma-informed lens, is really going to be making sense of the fact that the brain is developing kind of sequentially throughout your development. And so when you are in utero, the primary region of your brain that's developing is your brain stem. Once you're born, even though there's overlap, the primary region of the brain that's developing is going to be your midbrain for those first couple years of life. And then from kind of toddlerhood to middle school, the primary region of development is going to be your limbic system. And then from middle school all the way up to the end of adolescence, which depending on who you ask now is actually getting into your 30s, the primary region of development is going to be your cortex. And the reason that's important to understand is that what they've discovered about trauma is that it is less about what happens to you and more about when the traumatic event happens to you. because the region of the brain that's primarily developing at the time of the traumatic event is the region of the brain that's going to be most significantly impacted. And so if you have a child who's experienced some type of trauma in utero, that could be a parent that's utilizing substances or a parent that's experiencing domestic violence or under high levels of stress or anxiety, the primary region of the brain that's going to be impacted is the brain stem. And that's going to manifest itself in health and behavioral issues later in life. If a child experiences stress in the first couple of years of life, and that could be them experiencing the things that a parent experienced, them observing domestic violence in the household or having inconsistent caregiving, the primary region of the brain that's going to be impacted is going to be the midbrain. And that too will manifest itself in behavioral issues later in life. And what's important there is twofold. The first is that all of that has now occurred prior to that child actually possessing the ability to create memories. And so when we talk about being trauma informed, it's not about being informed of the traumas that that child has experienced, but instead it's about being informed of how the brain works and that recognition that it could be experiences that they have absolutely no memory of that are impacting how they are now responding, how they're behaving. But what's also important to understand there is that what we realize is that their behavior is less about a conscious decision to act a certain way, and it's more a response to how their brain has been developed to respond to stress. And that is so key and crucial to being able to apply any of the tools or strategies that we're talking about. Because what we're realizing is that we're not dealing with quote unquote bad kids. We're not dealing with children that are, waking up in the morning saying, man, how can I drive my teacher nuts today? Or how can I drive my counselor crazy? But instead it's somebody who's responding in the moment to an experience that their brain is perceiving as potentially dangerous, potentially stressful. And so that's what we need to keep in mind. And that's what's going to really open up our floodgates, if you will, to being able to provide the type of support that our children need to be able to be successful. So not only does the brain kind of develop in this way, but our brain's going to process information very quickly from the bottom up as well. And so all of our primary senses are connected to our brainstem, and the goal is that information comes in there and quickly moves its way up to the cortex. But under times of high stress, your brain will actually change in its functionality, and you'll end up operating primarily from those lower, what's called the more survival regions of the brain, than you would really be operating from those higher regions of the brain. The terminology that they use for that is called brain states. And really that's just, once again, it's an understanding of where you're at any given point in time. And so somebody that has not experienced any trauma can still be operating from a different brain state. I think the perfect case in point, you can look at ideally when you're in the cortex, you're nice and calm and you're feeling good. When you're in the limbic system, you're a little bit more alarmed. You're just wondering, am I safe right now? Am I not safe? As you move a little lower, you begin to get to that fear state. And then when you're in the bottom of the brain, you get to that terror state where it's just all about survival, all about how am I going to survive these next couple of seconds. And so our brain does that to keep us safe. If a wild animal walked into the room that I'm in right now, I don't want to be calm. I want to be a little bit fearful and terror. I want to be ready to respond to whatever's happening right there. But the problem is that things...
Josh?
Yes.
We're getting a request if you could speak a little bit slower.
Oh, sorry. And so the piece that we then want to be kind of mindful of with that is that we could have students that are responding in this way, and now they're operating from a lower region of the brain because of the stress that's coming at that moment in time. And so that's going to help us to understand that this is a child who normally could access the cortex, but because of the stress in the moment, they're now operating from the midbrain or the brainstem. And what's important to realize about that is that that's what's then going to lead our way to realizing what types of interventions we need to be putting in place, what types of things we need to put in place to be able to support them. Because what often happens is that we would choose interventions that aren't actually targeted at the region of the brain that somebody's operating from at that point in time. And so that's where we need to be able to focus things in more, and we're going to find a much higher success rate with a lot of these different tools and interventions. What I think is interesting, kind of a perfect case in point, something that we're experiencing globally right now, is that I can imagine that a lot of people that I've spoken with, as COVID-19 has gotten more and more serious, people have moved out of their cortex a lot more. They've been a lot more worried about their relationships. So they've been a lot more worried about just survival for the next couple minutes. And so some basic thinking and thought processes have been difficult. I teach a master's course, and a lot of my students have just been struggling a lot more academically because they're far more worried about, am I safe right now? Do I have food on the table right now? And so we are people that operate in that way. We're moving lower and lower in our brains just to survive the stressful moments that are happening. And so once again, our goal is to target tools and interventions at the region of the brain that somebody's operating from. And we'll get into an exhaustive list of what that looks like in just a couple minutes. But our goal is to be able to first identify what region of the brain somebody's operating from, and understanding what each region of the brain is in charge of really helps to paint a picture for what that looks like. And so the brainstem, for instance, that's your basic life functioning. Your brainstem is in charge of your blood pressure, your heart rate, your body's temperature. But imagine if those things aren't functioning correctly, whether it's due to stress in the moment or whether it's due to a maldevelopment. What can sometimes happen is that your blood pressure could, spike or plummet very rapidly, and your heart rate is going to follow that. What's that going to look like behaviorally? That's somebody that's going to have unpredictable and explosive behavior that just happens like that. All of a sudden, they could be flipping out, yelling, screaming, flipping a chair, or turning around and eloping out of the room. And you'd say, where did that come from? Well, that's a potential indicator that that's somebody that was operating out of their brainstem at that point in time. When you're in your brainstem, because of that inconsistency there, you're going to struggle to focus on any one thing for any extended period of time. And so there's going to be a lot of struggle to really just sit back and focus on a teacher talking, or sit and listen to me for 45 minutes if you're operating from that bottom part of your brain. And so you're going to struggle with that. And so it's our job, once again, to look at behaviors like that explosive behavior, like that lack of focus. And instead of getting punitive about it, realize that that's an amazing piece of information that we can then utilize to choose and select, how can I support that child right now? As you move a little higher, you get to the midbrain. The midbrain, the primary thing that we're really going to see in a lot of academic settings is going to be the large and fine motor skills. This could be a lapse in those skills. So somebody whose handwriting is atrocious, you can't fathom them kind of threading a needle, if you will, or their large motor skills are off. They look clumsy, they're off balance as they're walking around. That can be a sign that they have a maldevelopment in the midbrain. But if you're operating from the midbrain, it can also look like an overdependence on that part of the brain. So somebody who's constantly touching, tapping, walking around, hitting things, tapping other people, walking around out of the room, there's just that need to work from that part of the brain, that need to calm themselves down by being physical. As you get a little higher, you get to that limbic level, and that's that social emotional part of the brain. And so once again, that could be a lapse in skills where it's somebody who struggles to connect with their peers. It's somebody that you're going to struggle to connect with in some regard and not really feel kind of too close with them, or you can just kind of tell that there's kind of a social awkwardness there. But it can also be somebody that has emotional responses to non-emotional stimuli. What I mean by that is that you might have a child who you say, hey, can you push your chair in, please? And they look at you and say, why do you hate me? There's kind of a disconnect there. My request for you to push your chair in was not an assessment of our relationship. It was simply a basic request. But once again, that child is showing you that they might be in their limbic system right there by how they're responding to that. And so once again, we utilize that as an understanding of where they're at in the brain at that point in time. And then lastly is the cortex, which is your abstract and concrete thinking. That's where we expect students to be at when we're working with them, when we're educating them, when we're talking with them and problem solving with them. And this is where you can, be at your best academically, you can do your best problem solving. And so sometimes there's lapses in academic skills, and that's going to tell us that there's some room for growth at that cortical level. But there's another thing that we all do, which is called cortical modulation, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of before, but that's where we utilize our cortex to be able to calm down those lower regions of the brain. And so what we realize once again is that a lot of the students we're working with are going to struggle to be able to do that. And so their behaviors look disrespectful, they look disruptive, but what we need to realize is that it's probably less about them making a choice to behave a certain way. And instead, it resides a lot more in how their brain has developed and what their brain is really capable of doing at that point in time. And so that's how we really need to be thinking about and supporting our students. This is really common. I did not coin these terms. These were coined by Joe Fodorero, made popular a lot by Sandy Bloom, but it's a really good change in our thought process when we look at behavior, where we stop asking what's wrong with you. That's not solving any question at all. It's maybe just getting some of our own frustration and aggression out. But asking what's wrong with you doesn't really help a whole lot. But instead, we want to begin to think through what could have happened to cause you to react this way. And answering that question is not always essential, especially when it comes to trauma. Like, we don't, as a teacher, I don't need to know what happened in my child's life to know how to support them. But it's that recognition that this is less about them choosing to behave that way once again, and it's more about them basically having a brain that's been impacted by their life experiences that's then causing them to respond this way. Or additionally, it could be that something else is happening right now. And so once again, realizing everything that's going on with this global pandemic, that's impacting all of our children. They're seeing the news, they're seeing the adults in their life behaving differently and realizing that something really serious is going on. And so that's going to impact their behavior and how they're acting. Next year, when they're transitioning back into traditional schools, it's going to be different. It's going to be scary. It's going to be a little weird for them. And so that's going to be this obvious thing that has happened that's going to impact how some of them behave as we're getting back into schools. And so the best question we should be asking, instead of trying to figure out what's wrong with the child, and instead of being overly concerned with why are they behaving this way, is asking, what can we be doing to help? What can we do to help to support every single child that we have the opportunity to work with? And so really, I talked earlier about cortical modulation, which is that top-down approach. What we want to do is turn that upside down. And so a lot of you have heard of this whole idea of this bottom-up approach before. But what our goal is to be able to support students really from this bottom-up mentality, where we're thinking first about focusing in on those bottom regions of the brain and helping those regions of the brain to become regulated. And then we can think about the relationship that we have with students and making sure that they're feeling safe and supported and cared for. And once that is effectively accomplished, that's when we can then make the step to do what we were hired to do in the first place: the teaching, the collaboration with students, the problem solving, the setting rules and expectations for them. That can only happen if they feel safe and connected with you and if those bottom parts of their brain are regulated. So in an ideal world, this would happen in a very consistent and proactive way, where we always have kind of some different tools that we know would regulate those bottom regions of the brain at our disposal. And so as a student, for myself as a teacher, as students are coming into my classroom, I'm asking myself, do my students seem regulated right now? Are they as calm as they ever seem? Are they acting as age appropriate as they ever act? Can they focus as well as they could ever focus? If my answer to those questions is yes, I can put that mental check in and know they're pretty regulated. If not, I know that I need to provide something for them that would help them to become regulated. Once that's done, you move to the relationship where you're just asking, do the students feel safe and respected right now? If they do not respect you, they're going to have a tough time learning from you. And so figuring out, did anything get in the way of my relationship with a student at that point in time? It's even sometimes those little things that mean nothing to us, but might mean a lot to them. So for instance, I've had times where a student's running down the hallway, I raise my voice, not out of anger, but just because they're far away and I want them to hear me and say, hey, can you please slow down? Can you please stop running? And for me, it was this nothing moment, but I found out that other students were internalizing that. Why did Josh just yell at me? Why did he disrespect me in front of my friends? And I realized how valuable it is for me to catch up with a student then after to say, hey, thank you so much for stopping running. And I'm so sorry that I raised my voice. I wasn't mad. I just wanted to make sure that you could hear me. And so little moments like that go a long way in helping them to feel respected. And that's what's then going to set them up to be able to learn. And then once again, that reasoning is just what you were hired to do in the first place, whatever your role is, being able to accomplish that effectively. And then we're going to go through this cycle every 15, 20 minutes where, are they still regulated? Did anything happen that I need to address relationally? And then get back up to that reasoning piece. Now, this can happen in a very proactive way, but at times it can also be a reactive tool as well. So when children have exploded, erupted, then we also realize that we need to stop whatever our other goals are in that moment in time and begin to go through this process as well. I had a student once, I'll call him Johnny, and Johnny was in class one day. I think he was having a bad day because the teacher had said to him, if you do anything else, I'm going to send you out of the room. A few minutes later, the student sitting next to Johnny threw something in the room, and the teacher thought it was Johnny and sent him out of the class. Johnny goes down and says, hey, it wasn't me, it was this other student. It's not my fault, I shouldn't be here right now. And after a few minutes of going back and forth, whether this was reality or not, Johnny came to the conclusion that even though I didn't do this thing, I'm getting blamed for it and I'm gonna get in trouble for this. And when that happened, Johnny snapped. He started yelling and screaming and cursing up a storm. He started taking things off the counselor's desk and completely throwing them around the room. He started moving about the room and throwing the furniture around. There were these 2 large wooden cubbies in the room. He slammed his hands down on them. They broke and fell into pieces on the floor. He was completely losing it. I was down the hallway. Somebody ran and grabbed me. They said, Josh, you have a good relationship with Johnny. Can you come and talk to him? I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I walk into the room and I take one look at him and I'm just like, my relationship with him means nothing right now. I could throw my arm around him, try and say, hey, what's going on, bud? But that next chair is just going to come my direction because he's lower in the brain than that relationship exists. And so instead, I ran and I grabbed 2 large cups of water and I came back to the room where he was and I reached my hand out and I said, you look thirsty, bud. You want some water? And thankfully, he took that cup and he just started drinking it. And I just stood next to him and I said, take slow sips, take slow sips. It might look like I was just hydrating him for his next round of furniture throwing. But the truth is that drinking water is extremely regulating to that bottom part of our brain. That bottom part of our brain loves that basic life functioning. So simply hydration is good for the brain. When you drink water, it softens the bags of your lungs, which allows oxygen to more freely flow up to the brain. But another thing that works for every region of the brain is going to be focusing on breathing. And while he's not going to buy in at that moment to a traditional breathing exercise, drinking water forces you to control your breathing. So if he just took that water and tried to drink it quick, he would have spilled it all over himself. He had to slow his breathing down to drink that water, which is why I stood next to him, not talking about consequences, not asking him what happened, but simply saying, take slow sips, take slow sips. And so slowly he drank that first cup of water, and then I handed him the second cup of water, and I walked past him, and I started picking stuff up from around the room, just the small stuff, the pens, the pencils, the pieces of paper, and I just kept an eye on him. And when I saw that he finished that second cup of water, I walked over to a large piece of wood from that wooden cubby and I said, hey, this is too heavy for me, bud. Can you help me pick this up? And thankfully he walked over next to me and together we picked that up and we put it across the room and then we moved all the furniture as best we could. What I want to be clear about here is that no part of me said or implied to him, you made this mess, you better clean it up. That's cortical. He's not ready for that yet. In fact, I started cleaning up the room myself first because I wanted to model to him that I'm going to clean up this room regardless, but if you help me, that'd be great. That way it didn't feel punitive at all because he wasn't ready for a punishment. And instead, the reason I wanted him to join me is that utilizing your large muscles in a controlled way is going to be activating to that midbrain. And so that drinking that water is going to be activating to the brainstem, utilizing his muscles in a controlled way to be activating to the midbrain. And so all of that is working together to really help that regulation to occur. By the time we had the room cleaned up as best we could, I looked at him and those eyes that were darting around the room when I first walked in could now focus on me. His breathing had slowed down. He was no longer exhibiting any of the behaviors of concern. And I knew that now my relationship with him mattered. So I spent the next 5 to 8 minutes just chatting with him. Once again, not getting into any of the other, details or consequences, but just we're 2 human beings having a conversation. He needed to remember, this is Josh. I respect Josh. Josh respects me. I can trust him. We have a good relationship. And we needed to get back to there together. And once that was accomplished, after 5 to 8 minutes of just joking, kind of our inside jokes and stories and talking about things that I knew he was interested in, then I knew that we could get to the reasoning piece. Then I knew that we could get to that highest level of thinking, which we weren't doing anything extraordinarily complex, but basic problem solving. Hey, we need you to go home now. Hey, there's going to be, other consequences for this. You're not going to be at school tomorrow. There's going to be bills that come in the mail. We're going to have to talk about this more tomorrow. So there's different consequences, but he was able to hear that and receive that and not get re-triggered by that information. He was able to advocate for himself, that we would call and explain the situation to somebody, that he could wait in a different room because he was feeling closed off in the room where he was at. And so you could see through this process that we were able to get him up to that cortex. And even though it was obviously not his best day, given what was going on, it ended as well as it possibly could. Because we weren't focused on what do we need to accomplish right now, where do we want him to be right now, but instead we were able to focus on where is he operating from right now, and we're able to then really sequentially work our way upwards from there. And so that's the approach that we're really trying to accomplish. So in a moment, I want to dive into a lot of the different interventions that you can put in place for all of those different regions of the brain to help a student to be able to become calm, to be able to, whether it's proactively or reactively to calm them down, keep them in as calm a state as possible. But there's a few things that you'll see can kind of overlap throughout some of those different lists. And one that I want to do with you right now, just because I realize that it's going to be a tool that can actually help you to learn and help this time to go really well. A tool that we utilize a lot is brain breaks. And the basic reason behind our rationale for brain breaks is understanding that the brain can only take so much information at one time. And so I've been talking to you now for about 27 minutes. And as I've been talking, information's coming in and you're trying to process and make sense of that information. But while you're doing that, I keep talking. And so you're not going to be able to gather every single word that I'm saying. By building in brain breaks, you can build in opportunity for a brain to process one piece of information and then prepare it to receive what that next piece of information is. And so I want to do a brain break with you all right now. That is just one of our crowd favorites. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do it real quick, just have a little bit of fun with it. But really, part of that is an opportunity to kind of create a transition from the science piece to now getting into all of the different interventions that we want to be talking about. And so the brain break that I want to do real quick, and I know that you'll feel awkward in whatever setting you're in right now, but I encourage you to join in with me, is called ABC 1, 2, 3. And what I want you to do is, in large air letters out in front of your body, if you're able, I'd love for you to do the alphabet. So you'll draw an A, then a B, then a C. But when you draw the A, if you're able to, given the setting that you're at right now, I'd love for you to say out loud the number 1. And when you draw the B, your goal is to say out loud the number 2. And your goal is to get to Z and be saying out loud the number 26. So like I said, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds right now to just give that a try real quick. All right, because I want to be sensitive to your time, I know that that was not nearly enough time for most people to get through the whole alphabet, but I want to make sure that we're still moving forward. But real quick, there's a couple things that I love about that activity. The first is that it's probably something that, especially if you're with a group of people, it makes you laugh pretty quickly. As you're trying to do it, you mix it up, it's kind of goofy. And as you're attempting to do that, people start to laugh. Laughter is extremely regulating. And so keep that in mind as you're thinking about different tools that help. Laughter is something that's going to be really advantageous for people. It's kind of like a breathing exercise. You get more air into your body when you laugh. But also, if you've ever been working with a student, you see they get that furrowed brow. Getting them to laugh actually loosens the muscles in their face, which helps them to calm down from the outside in. The second thing about that activity is that it has you crossing over. It's called your body's midline. From nose to navel down to the floor to the top of your head, your body has a midline. And anytime you're crossing over it, you're invigorating both hemispheres of the brain. The two hemispheres of your brain are connected by this fiber called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is essentially these neuropathways that allow the two hemispheres of your brain to communicate with one another. And what they found is that especially those who have been impacted by trauma, they usually have an underdevelopment of that corpus callosum, meaning there's less communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. And so doing activities that have you crossing your body's midline, that helps you to actually kind of prime the pump, so to speak. It helps you to get both regions of the brain communicating as well as you possibly can. But lastly, and perhaps most important, I'm going to guess that while you were doing that activity, if you gave it a try, you weren't thinking about everything else you had to do today. You weren't thinking about your weekend plans. Maybe for the first time, you weren't even thinking about the coronavirus. You were thinking about your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s. And so that's what's so great about some of these activities is just thinking through, how can I distract my students for a moment? I'll have students that would come into my classroom and they would be fixated on all sorts of real life issues that they're facing. Whether it's that they just broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, they got in a huge fight with their parents that morning, they had a friend get locked up the night before. I've had kids come into my class that don't know if they're going to be evicted from their home when they get off the bus at the end of the day. Yet I'm saying, all right, let's jump into some Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 1. And that is such a leap for where they're at that point in time. And so doing something like this, it gets their brain fixated on something futile, which then gives me the opportunity to transition their energy into whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish that day. And so does this buy you an 8-hour day? Absolutely not. It buys you about 20 minutes. And so our goal is to really think through what types of tools can I put in place that are going to buy us 20 minutes at a time, that we can begin to piece together the day a little bit at a time. And so as we're looking through these different interventions, please realize that it's not like a one idea is going to just fix everything, but instead it's a lot of thinking through how can I piece together ideas like this or make recommendations to students for ideas like this that would then help to be able to be in place all throughout the course of the day, both while they're at home and when they're at school. That's just going to help to keep them in that part of the brain where they're going to be able to be calm. You know, the ultimate goal behind all of this is just creating that level of calm for our students where they're able to be in a place where they're ready to learn, they're ready to handle the obvious stressors that come with being in an academic setting. But what often happens, as I said earlier, is that we aim too high in the brain. And so our goal is that we need to make sure that we're focusing interventions on the region of the brain that somebody's operating from, or it's okay for us to go too low in the brain. But when we go too high, that's when we end up triggering people and getting them upset and not really being as effective with the different tools that we're trying to support them with. And so first off, we want to look at the brainstem. Remember, the brainstem, first off, is always safe because you can't go too low in the brain. However, in addition, the brainstem is going to be when you see somebody that's kind of has that unpredictable behavior, they have significant issues with their focus at that point in time, you know, there's that explosive behavior that they're exhibiting. Those are going to be potential indicators that that's somebody that's operating out of their brainstem. And so what we need to think through is how can I then activate that brainstem? And that's what's going to help to, once again, sequentially move them upwards in the brain. The basic rule of thumb that you can work with the brainstem is thinking about what would work for a newborn child, because a newborn child only has a fully developed brainstem. But then our goal is to think through how can I make that socially appropriate. So for instance, I spoke about Johnny a couple of minutes ago. He often, because of some life experiences that he had, would be operating from that brainstem level. And what are things that work for a newborn child? Well, rocking them back and forth. Well, Johnny's 17 years old. I'm not going to pick him up in my arms and rock him back and forth. The one thing that we found worked really well for him was to get a rocking chair that he was able to sit in class. And so him being able to literally just rock back and forth while he was in class was an amazing tool for him to be able to stay calm. It activated his brainstem, and that helped him to be able to stay in class longer, to stay focused on material longer, and it brought down the likelihood that he was going to have those explosive responses to things significantly. And so we're thinking through what works for the brainstem, and then how do I make it available and socially appropriate to a child that it's going to be helpful for them. Healing touch and massage is another thing that we do with children, being able to just hug them, embrace them. We swaddle them up tight and wrap them up. And so that's another thing. But as kids get older, we need to be really, really careful about any physical touch that we're making with them. But you can almost look at what are children already doing. They're putting their hoods on, they're keeping their backpacks on because they like that weight. They're refusing to take jackets off. They're not going to be able to articulate to you that the reason that I'm doing this is because it makes me feel safer. But that's often a lot of what's behind some of those things. And so sometimes it's rethinking what are some of our rules and expectations for students. Do we want to rethink our rules around them keeping their backpacks on or them wearing hoodies? Or if not, what else can we replace it with? Can we allow them to wear blankets? We've done a lot with buying sheets of Lycra, which is that really stretchy material, and kids can wrap that around themselves, and that gives them just that swaddling feeling that they're able to have. We actually started to buy weighted equipment and found that a lot of students would buy into that really well. Not getting huge blankets in the classroom, but just like weighted lap pads that they could put over their shoulder or put over their lap. And that weight behind that was really helpful for them. This was an area especially where when I started presenting this to districts initially, we began to get a lot of pushback that, you know, we would never have kids that felt comfortable using a weighted blanket or, a blanket or anything like that in a classroom. And what we found was that though it seemed weird at first, kids are willing to buy into things if they find that it works for them. And so we just started to get things and make it available to students. We didn't say this is only for you or for you, but we make it universally available to all students. And when they eventually try something and find that it works, they're going to keep going back to it. And then we make it, as I said, universally available. So it takes away any stigma that this is only for that child or this is only for that child. And it increases the likelihood that those that need it are going to buy into those tools. But what's also interesting is that we have found again and again that these things don't get misused, that those that need it keep gravitating towards it, but those that don't aren't really interested in it. So for instance, we had found that rocking chairs worked really well. And the fear that a lot of people had is if we get rocking chairs, everybody's going to want to try them. And that is true on day 1 and 2, that everybody's going to want to try it when it's something that's brand new. But what we found was that if we made that readily available to everybody, that very quickly, once everybody had their opportunity to try it, that then only those that really benefited from it kept gravitating towards it. Even for myself, I remember thinking like, that's so cool. I wish that I had had a rocking chair in my classroom when I was younger. And then I sat in it, and after about 30 seconds, I was like, I hate this thing. It's uncomfortable. I can't write notes while I'm rocking back and forth. And so I didn't enjoy that at all. And a lot of our students are that way as well. But for those that it benefited, we found that it really helped them and that they kept gravitating towards that tool that made sense and worked for them. Primary somatosensory, that's obviously just utilizing any of your 5 primary senses. This is one that gets really, really individualized for students. So this is better for those of you that happen to work one-on-one, or if you're trying to support a child when they're at home or your own children at home. This is where you can find a scent that works for them. And so there's a lot with essential oils and whatnot right now, but if you can find a scent that they just find calming, just making that available, even putting just like a dot of a smell on a cotton ball that they can keep in their pocket or keep close to them. That's just something that's readily available that can help to keep them calm. Different tastes, spearmint and peppermint are tastes that often are going to be a little bit, awakening and calming for children. So just finding something, whether it's a mint or gum that they're able to have, that's going to be able to help them to calm them down. Different textures. This is where we do a lot with fidgets, and they're just different fidgets that have textures that they're going to like to touch, or finding, you can put the little pieces of Velcro underneath your desk and touching something like that. Some students really like. I would get those free carpet samples from a flooring store, and my students just wanting to be able to touch that and pick on that. And so finding a texture that they just find pleasing, that they're able to just have readily available, that they can be touching, that's something that's going to be calming for a lot of kids to have at their disposal. Even think about visually, what does the space look like? Do I have pictures up on the wall that they could look at that are going to be calming to them? Thinking about the colors and even just how tidy the space is. Like if it's cluttered, that's going to be dysregulating. And so being in an organized space is something that visually is going to be calming to a child. And so just looking at how can I focus in on the senses to create a space or create opportunity for a child to be able to calm themselves down. There's really, really controlled and basic movements like balance, stretching, yoga is a little lower, some basic martial arts where you're just getting very, very controlled movements that are going to be helpful for this part of the brain. You can do even very basic review activities where you could ask a student, true or false. If the answer is true, balance on your right foot. If it's false, balance on your left foot right now. And so that's a learning activity that's going to help to be able to access that part of the brain. You could have them walk a balance beam, tape a balance beam in your classroom and just have one foot in front of the other. So as they're walking that, they're getting a little bit of that balance. You can do, a lot of teachers would do like Simon Says and, have them just do different stretches with Simon Says. The trick is just always have Simon say it. Never have Simon not say anything, so that you're able to just keep them all engaged in the activity as long as you're wanting them to be part of it. And so just finding those really, really, really controlled movements are going to be helpful at that brainstem level. Chewing and sucking, once again, this is something that you're going to see a newborn child do, is that they want something in their mouth. And so this is one in particular where you can look and see a child is already going to be doing this if it's something that calms them, but they're probably getting in trouble for it. They're getting told you're too old to have your thumb in your mouth, or stop chewing on your shirt, stop chewing on your hair. And our goal is, once again, can we provide something socially appropriate to them that's going to help them in that regard? And so what can we provide? We've, whether it's changing rules around gum, or once again, if they're at home, can they be chewing gum or have a lollipop in their mouth? We've gotten chew jewelry that you would use for a teething infant, and a child could just wear a necklace and put that little silicone thing in their mouth, and it's something they could chew on. This is not something that we've had to do for a lot of kids, but for those that needed it, it was absolutely game changing for them. It supported so many different kids that they were able to get help from it. Music and drumming is one that, once again, can work for every region of the brain. When you're thinking about the brainstem, a lot of it is around listening to music. The goal with music is that you want it to be calming music. You want it to be no words, about 60 beats per minute, and ideally music that would not be familiar to them, because you would hate for it to be music that was playing during a traumatic moment in their life. But your heartbeat tries to meet that of the music that you're listening to. And so we would have teachers that would play music all throughout class, and you don't have to play it very loudly at all, just very faintly in the background is enough for your brain just to hear it and begin to try and, once again, match that music. We play it in our hallways, in our open spaces, in our cafeteria, once again, just in the background, but we saw it significantly impacted the number of fights that we would have, the number of even students getting like posturing towards one another. It really made a big difference there. Breathing is a huge one for the brainstem. Being able to just doing really controlled breathing exercises, whether it's, breathe in for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4, using the, drinking water strategy, but also keep in mind that you can have fun with this. It could be blowing bubbles if they're a young kid. I would always do an activity with a lot of my students, which was you would, make a little paper football where you make a little triangle out of a piece of paper. And instead of flicking it across the desk, you have to use your breath and try and get it to just be leaning over the side of a desk. And so they're playing a game where they're blowing something across their desk, but that's helping them to actually calm down. You could do breathing or review games where, A, B, C, and D are the 4 corners of a desk or a table, and they have to blow a cotton ball to that corner. So once again, having a little fun with it, but creating an opportunity where they're using their breath in a controlled way. And then animal assisted activities as well. If that's something you have access to, what's great about animals, once again, they can work with every single region of the brain, but you also utilize different neural pathways to connect to animals than you do to human beings. So you could have a child who literally hates every human in your school or in your building or in your home, but they could connect to an animal. And so they would say things to an animal that they wouldn't say to you. That animal could work to calm them down where a human being might not be able to help to calm them down. And then if you have a human being that's kind of attached to that animal, they can kind of use that animal to scaffold and begin to create rapport and relationship with a human being. I wanted to spend the most here on the brainstem because this is what is kind of missing the most often. This is where, schools, especially as students are getting older and older, we start doing less and less with. And so we want to make sure that we have a lot of tools here, especially because the brainstem's also always that safe go-to that we can utilize, because you can never go too low in the brain. The midbrain, keep in mind, as we're moving one level up in the brain, is that part of the brain that's kind of your large and fine motor skills primarily is what we'll see. And so with this, the basic rule of thumb that kind of encapsulates a lot of these different activities is that these students need to move. And they're either going to move on their terms or on our terms. And if they're doing it on their terms, they're probably going to get in trouble for it. So we want to create opportunities for them to move. So walking, running, exercise, just having a space or giving breaks throughout the day where they're able to just do a quick walk, do a lap, allowing them, even though you know that they don't need it, sure, go get a drink of water if you know that they're going to come back after 30 seconds being in a slightly better spot. We began to get desk cycles and desk ellipticals that we would put underneath our desks that students could actually just pedal while they're in class. And once again, this was game changing for a lot of our kids. Kids that before would not stay in their seats and then they'd be distracting other learners can now just stay in their seats and pedal, because it wasn't about them trying to be disruptive. It was about their body saying, you need to move right now. And so we're being responsive to what their body is telling them that they need. There's a lot of brain breaks you can do that would have physical movement built into it, whether it's doing the air spelling like we did with ABC 1, 2, 3, whether it's getting stretching and physical movement or other little, brain twister ideas where you could just get them physically moving a little bit or crossing their bodies midline with different movements. All of that is going to be activating to the midbrain. Creative arts are something that are extremely important for the midbrain, just getting them, we do less and less of this as students are getting older and older, but lots of opportunities to cut things out, to color, to draw, to doodle. There's research that shows that those that doodle can actually learn more than those that don't. And so just allowing students to do that. I always just think it's important that we collaborate with students. If I have a student that tells me I do better if I can doodle, I say, sure, today, why don't you doodle a little more, but I'm going to call on you a little more today. And if you are on point and it's not disruptive to you, then we've got a great plan. If that doesn't work, then we need to collaborate together and come up with a better plan in the future. But it's just that work that we're doing with students to find something that works for them. For a lot of my students, what I would ultimately do is if they needed to doodle, but doodling was too disruptive for them, I would give them a blank comic strip, and that was their note page for the day. So whatever we're talking about today, I want you to write a comic about that, and then the captions are kind of their notes for the day. Large muscle movement, we talked about that earlier. So just that ability to have them move furniture, have them carry textbooks around or hand out the textbooks, hand out the classwork, or the students that need to collect that classwork, creating opportunities for that are going to be extremely important. I think that it's really important that we think about some of this, especially with remote learning right now, where we have less control over what the students are doing. Giving them that encouragement to get up, walk around, even in our remote learning, having breaks where they can get up and be like, all right, everybody's, do a lap around whatever room you're in and come back in 30 seconds, or do chair push-ups where you push up on the chair that you're in and try and lift your body up. So creating opportunities to do some of that large muscle movement and reminding them to do that when we don't actually have them in our setting that we would want to have them at that point in time. I'm going to jump down to the bottom as well and just do horticulture real quick. There's a lot you can do in a big way with horticulture, but also just having plants in the classroom that students can water and pick off the dead leaves. Those are just little large and fine motor skill activities that they're able to participate in that are going to be able to be calming for them. And then I want to move to the limbic system, which is, remember, that's that social emotional. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this because that is something that we've already kind of figured out a lot, and it's built in a lot more, but it's making students feel safe and cared for, taking care of counseling and mentoring and small group activities, and doing a lot of brain breaks that would be small group brain breaks where they're collaborating and working together, and just giving them a lot of praise around that so their brain is hearing, I worked together in a group and I got a positive outcome from it. The one thing that we always mention here with the limbic level is parallel interaction, which is a lot harder to do remotely, obviously, but when you're live with somebody, being able to come shoulder to shoulder with them rather than face to face with them. They're going to just be able to receive that information a lot better. It's a lot less stressful to be shoulder to shoulder with somebody than it is to be face to face with them. But so much of this is just about making sure that they feel safe and cared for and valued when they're with you. And once again, that's what's going to help to then get them up to that top part of the brain. And so lastly is the cortex, and the way that you develop the cortex is simply what you were hired to do in the first place. That's the learning, the educating, the problem solving that you do. If I've done my job today, your cortexes have all changed slightly as you've hopefully learned something new and developed new ideas or practices that would work for the children that you have the opportunity to work with. But that can only happen if those lower parts of the brain are activated as well. And real quick, I just wanted to put in a couple of different resources just that would lead you to some places for some of the activities that we talked about. You saw the brain breaks. There's lots of different spots you can find brain breaks online. We do have a brain break book that you can look up as well. It's also on Amazon, but that's the title of it, a curriculum for teaching students about this. We get our weighted equipment. There's lots of places to get it from, but we found a company called capable.com, and they create a lot of really amazing high quality stuff. And then fidgets and other things similar to fidgets, we go to Trainer's Warehouse or therapyshop.com. Therapy Shop has a lot of the fidgets, but also different things for oral stimulation as well that could really work for a lot of students. So from there, I want to open it up for any questions that have come through the comments, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see my face again.
Thank you so much, Josh. We're just all breathless with the amount of information that you managed to cram in there in 50 minutes. People have been saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is great. Wish all teachers could hear this, and so forth. We're getting a lot of thank you, but this is also the time. We have about 8 minutes for questions. If anybody would like to write them in the chat, then that would be great. There are a few suggestions here about what other people use, how they use humor. By the way, I did say at the beginning, the slides will be emailed to whoever registered for this, and this is also being recorded. That's the big question here, so that it will be up on the Haruv Institute YouTube channel. Yeah. Probably it'll take a couple of days because we're kind of in it.
I was going to say, I did just see there was the question about how schools rely so much on kind of the punitive practice and how do we go about getting this across to administrators. And first off, I would say, unfortunately, from my experience, there is not kind of one clear path for being able to do that. Every school system I've worked with is a little bit different, but by far the most effective thing that I found is that minimally in your classroom or in whatever kind of setting you have, as you put these things into place, being able to support students differently and share those results with as many people as will listen to you. Because what usually other teachers and administrators listen to more than anything is going to be, what are the results that we're finding from it? And so even early on at our school, even though I worked for an organization that was bought in, I would have a lot of some administrators, but mostly other teachers that were saying like, they just, kind of, we need that pound of flesh, so to speak. Like we just need more punitive measures. This isn't working. And then we'd sit in a meeting and we'd be talking about a student and they'd say, man, this kid's driving me nuts. He's not doing any work. He's not doing any of this. And I'd be able to say, they're doing all of this for me. This is, they're being great in my class, but here's what I'm doing different. And so that's what's led in a lot of spaces for some of that buy-in. But I'd also say at that administrative level, at least in the States, I know that not everybody here is from the States, but it's getting more and more common that people need to be paying attention to trauma-informed work that's out there. And so even just encouraging them or leading them, whether it's to, our organization or other organizations that do work like this, and just encouraging them, go check it out, or even, linking them to us, we can kind of talk about what that approach looks like. But it is very different from a lot of our classic approaches to doing this.
Okay, we have a question, Josh. Any suggestions if you're a guest educator and it's not your classroom? And another question, what are mobile options?
Yeah. So first off, when it's not your classroom, I mean, on the one hand, it's so difficult because you're going in and you have to buy that relational rapport at the same time as trying to utilize a lot of these different tools. What's going to be so key, especially when you're a stranger in that space, is almost going to be a greater focus on your own level of calm and self-care than some of the tools that you might utilize. People, we all have what's called mirror neurons that fire when you see something occurring in the same way that they would fire if you were doing that thing yourself. And so when you go into a new environment, you're a stranger, and those that, especially people that have experienced trauma before, they are automatically going to be, for lack of better terminology, pushing your buttons to see, can I trust this person? Are they safe or not? And that then often makes somebody begin to raise their voice, get frustrated, get anxious, and that then proves to them this isn't a safe person. And so the more that we can pass those tests early on and be safe right in that setting there, the more that we're going to be able to continue to engage and work with them. And so if you're in that setting, pay a lot of attention to your own level of self-care first, how calm you can be before you enter into the room, and just have some of your favorite go-tos. So for instance, every room I go into, I do that ABC 1, 2, 3. People laugh, they love it. A lot of people buy into that. So have a couple of your favorites that can just kind of be icebreakers that are going to buy some interest into that. And then, and a lot of that can work kind of remotely as well, where you're just trying to, you're adding more and more layers that are going to be difficult, but picking what some of your favorite tools are that could kind of prove to them like, hey, I'm here for you, I care about you, and we can have fun with this. And then with any tool that you try, whether you're brand new to trying something, whether you're a visitor in a classroom, or whether you're establishing a new norm with your students, always give a short explanation as to here's why. And the reason why you might be doing anything new or weird or odd is because I think it's going to help you. I think it's going to support you. I think that this is something that's going to make this time that we're spending together a little bit better. And I find that students respond to that. They appreciate hearing not what they need to do different to fit into your classroom, but what you're willing to do different to fit into them. And that's something that's a powerful statement for kids to hear.
Thank you, Josh. Another question is, could this information be easily applied to adult learners?
Absolutely. I mean, the bottom line is that the way the brain works is consistent throughout. I mean, the big difference is that if you're working with an elementary child, obviously their cortex isn't fully developed yet, but when you're working with an adult, their brain still brings in information to the bottom and it works sequentially upwards. And the cool thing about the brain is that it can change and develop at any point in time. So somebody in their 40s that had early childhood trauma that might have maldevelopment to their brainstem or to their midbrain, you'll probably be able to tell by some of their behaviors that something isn't quite right. But what science would tell us is that the brain is malleable. But what's likely happening is that they're in a phase of life now where some of those tools that we talked about that would activate that brain stem are not really occurring on a consistent basis for them. And so a lot of it is thinking back through, how do I provide those things to them on a consistent basis, or even just when we are working together, making those things available. So we actually worked with a group of, I know it's random, but a group of roofers before, but they were telling us that in their customer service, they would always be going to people and they're suddenly telling people, sorry, you need a new roof. It's going to cost $30,000. And immediately adults are dropping into those bottom parts of the brain. And so we were working with them to develop what are those skills that we can be thinking about that are really going to be able to support and help them in that moment, whether it's just, if I take a deep breath, they're going to be following that as well. What's my proximity to them in this moment? If I'm too close, they're not going to feel as safe. So let me get a little bit further away from them. I always hand them a pen so they have something they could fidget with in their hand. So just even basic tools like that could be helpful.
Thank you. There was one more question earlier on about students that are diagnosed with ADHD, and if this is something that's applicable, what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so absolutely. So first and foremost, some of what's been discovered is that, you know, a lot of the diagnoses that are out there because there's not a whole lot that really covers trauma very well in the DSM. And so we would look at a behavior and then suddenly be making a diagnosis based on that. And so sometimes there's people that are probably diagnosed with ADHD that it's much more a brainstem maldevelopment, because the two could look very, very similar, but you would treat them both very, very differently in terms of you wouldn't necessarily use the same medication for somebody that has PTSD as you would for somebody that has ADHD, obviously. And so what we have found is that utilizing tools that match the behavior are always going to work. The difference is that if you have somebody that truly has ADHD, you will have short-term successes, but not necessarily all of the long-term development that you would want. Whereas if it's somebody that has maldevelopment in the brainstem, yet you provide some of that to them, you might actually begin to see that that brainstem begins to develop more and they become less and less reliant upon those brainstem interventions.
Okay, and the last question I will ask, somebody asked right at the beginning about birth trauma or concussions and how those actually can affect children later on.
So, I mean, so like birth, for instance, like lack of, you know, even like lack of oxygen at birth is something that, so obviously it was nothing intentional at all from anybody, but that can cause some maldevelopment to that brainstem as well. And so it just, it gets in the way of some of that development. And so once again, it might be something as random as that. And then as the child's getting older and older, you see that there's some behavioral issues that are of concern. You don't jump to, oh, they must be a bad kid. It's just, there could be something. It could even be something that the parent doesn't even ever think about anymore because it was a scary 30 seconds of their life that then turned into nothing. But it could actually have a long-term impact on that brainstem, which is once again why I always say when you look at the behavior, we just assume that student wants to do well, but something else is prohibiting them from being able to behave the manner in which we're expecting it. And so we don't ever just jump to, we need to convince them to change their behavior. It's let's look at the behavior and keep providing tools and interventions that are matching that part of the brain that they're seemingly operating